please!
You have any idea who I am? I signed a $4 million check for this hospital. You'll be handing in your badge before this shift is over.
That's your choice to make, but you are still not walking past me down this hall.
You'll regret this!
She was supposed to be nobody. That's what the men in the dark SUV assumed as they rolled past the hospital that gray morning. They were wrong about that. And so was the billionaire who had just made the single worst decision of his entire life. The ICU never truly rested. Machines chirped in careful rhythm. The air carried the smell of antiseptic and swallowed grief. The nurses on this floor moved quickly and spoke rarely, because up here a lost second could be a lost life, and everybody knew it. Ayanna Cole had walked these tiles for 6 years. At 31, she was the one the newer nurses paged when a vein rolled and gave out, when a family folded in on itself in the corridor. When a patient crashed at 3 in the morning and every other set of hands froze, she was the still center that kept the whole floor from tipping over. She was also 7 months pregnant. Her ankles ached. A low, grinding heaviness settled into her spine somewhere around the 4th hour of every 12-hour stretch. She never said a word about it. She only pressed one palm to the curve of her belly between rooms, pulled in a slow breath, and kept moving. And before we go any further, if stories about quiet people who end up having the final word are the kind of thing you're here for, go ahead and subscribe and turn on the bell, because this one turns in a way you will not see coming. None of the people she worked beside knew much about her life past those double doors. She never mentioned where she'd come up. She never spoke about family. When someone asked, she smiled, softened it, and steered the conversation somewhere else. Nobody knew. Nobody was meant to. Nobody knew that the calm woman straightening an IV line in room 6 was the foster sister of a man once whispered about as Baek Sung-il. Wait, not that name. That name belonged to a boy who had stopped existing a long time ago. His name now was Han Jae-woon, and Han Jae-woon did not spend his days in hospitals. Han Jae-woon did not attend charity dinners or turn up on any list of wealthy men. He moved through the city like a cold current underneath still water, unseen right up until the second he chose to take something apart. He was the most feared man in the Pacific Northwest's underworld. His organization answered to no name written anywhere. His face lived in no police file. He had kept that entire world sealed away from Ayanna for years, not out of shame, but because she had asked him to. Let me be ordinary. She'd told him once, back when they were teenagers with nothing, let me just be a regular person. He had kept that promise every single day. But calm, it turns out, makes enemies of its own. The doors at the far end of the corridor flew open at 2:14 in the afternoon. Every head on the floor snapped toward the sound. The man striding through them wore a slate-gray suit that cost more than most of the nurses earned in a season. His name was Weston Vale. He was 44, the founder of 3 tech companies, and a man who had never once heard the word no without making somebody pay for it. Trailing behind him, a jittery assistant pressed a folded napkin to Weston's left palm, a small cut. The kind you get from a shattered wine glass at lunch. The kind that needs a bandage, not an intensive care unit. Weston didn't know that, or, more honestly, Weston didn't care. He swept his eyes across the floor like a man surveying property he already owned, which in his own mind he practically did. His last gift had built the hospital's new cardiac wing. He kept the framed thank you letter to prove it. I need a doctor, right now. His voice cut clean over the monitors. Not a trainee, a real one. A young physician named Daniel hurried toward him, palms open, voice low, and tried to explain that this was critical care, that the assistant's cut was minor, that the main emergency department sat 2 floors below. Weston seized the front of Daniel's coat and shoved him sideways into the wall. The whole floor stopped breathing. Weston stepped forward, aiming himself toward a room where a 67-year-old man lay recovering from open-heart surgery. His eyes hunted for an empty bed, a nurse he could bark at. Anyone who would simply obey. Ayanna walked out of room 6. She didn't hurry. She didn't lift her voice. Weston stopped mid-step, His jaw went tight. He looked at her the way certain powerful men look at people they've already filed under irrelevant, like a piece of furniture that had inexplicably begun to speak. "Do you have any idea who I am?" His voice dropped into something meaner. "I signed a $4 million check for this building. You'll be handing in your badge before this shift is over." "That's your choice to make," Ayanna said. She didn't move an inch. "But you are still not walking past me down this hall." Something behind his eyes shifted. The polished anger split open, and something colder came through the crack. He reached into his jacket and drew out a slim leather card case. He flipped it open and held it toward the young doctor still flattened against the wall. "Write a number," Weston said. "Whatever it costs to move one of these patients to another floor. I don't care which one. I need the bed." Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Ayanna answered for him. "Put that away." Her voice never wavered. "Money doesn't decide which patients are stable enough to move." The man in room 4 came out of open-heart surgery 11 hours ago. "He is not being relocated for a cut on your hand." Weston turned to face her slowly, the case still open. "You're a nurse?" he said, and the way he said it dragged the word down into an insult. "You don't make those calls." "On this floor," she said. "I do." For one held breath, nobody moved. Then Weston came apart, loud and ugly and endless. He called her useless. He said her scrubs looked like they'd come off a clearance rack. He mocked her schooling, her paycheck, her place. He said things that made the younger nurses at the station stare hard at the floor. Ayanna took every word without so much as a blink. She turned toward the wall phone to call security. That was the moment Weston struck her. The sound of it was wrong. Far too sharp for a hospital. Far too loud. It tore through the hush of the ICU like something breaking that was never meant to break. His open hand caught the side of her face with everything behind it. Her head whipped sideways. The clipboard slipped from her grip and clattered to the tile. She staggered back a step, one shoulder catching the edge of the nursing station, and her hands flew straight to her belly, both of them wrapping around the curve of it, shielding it. She didn't fall, but her eyes shut for a single second, and that second said everything. The floor went silent, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that follows something that can't be taken back. A young nurse named Rosa stood frozen at her station, both hands clamped over her mouth. The guard near the elevator had a hand on his radio and hadn't moved. Nobody had moved. It was as if the air had been pulled out of the entire building. Weston tugged his cuffs straight. "Maybe now you understand how this works," he said. Down the corridor, near the stairwell exit, a tall man in a black coat stood with his hands buried in his pockets. He hadn't shifted since the doors first opened. He'd watched all of it, the shove, the threats, the strike, the way her hands had gone to her stomach. On the left side of his neck sat a small tattoo, a raven's eye, half-lidded, staring straight ahead. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He drew out his phone, typed 4 words, sent them, and slipped quietly through the side door. Dr. Langston arrived 60 seconds later. Chief of Medicine, 62 years old, silver hair, a reputation for staying steady when everything around him was on fire. He walked in, read the room in one sweep, Ayanna still bracing herself against the counter, Weston standing with his arms folded, and made his call in under 3 seconds. He called it wrong. "Mr. Vale, doctor," Langston said, crossing to him with a hand already extended, his voice smooth as glass. "I am so sorry about this. Let's get you looked after right away." Ayanna stared at him. He didn't glance at her. Not once. Weston rolled his shoulders. "Your nurse was hostile and got in the way of patient care. I defended myself. Doctor." Langston nodded along as if he were being handed a pleasant weather report. He didn't pull the cameras. He didn't ask a single witness. He didn't so much as look at the red welt blooming across the face of the pregnant woman 10 feet from him. He turned to Ayanna, and his voice went flat. "I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and clear out your locker." The shock landed somewhere behind her ribs, not the words. She'd half expected the words the instant Langston walked in and didn't check on her first. It was the witnesses. The nurses and doctors and guards who had just watched a man slap a pregnant woman across the face, now studying their own shoes. 2 guards walked her out. Not roughly, but firmly, the way people move when they've been told to make it look official. She handed over her badge. She poured her locker into a paper sack. She walked the long main corridor past patients she had nursed back from the edge, past the break room where she'd eaten 1,000 lunches, past the room where she'd once held a stranger's hand as he died because no family ever came. The front doors slid open. Cold air hit her cheeks. It was raining. She stood on the wet sidewalk and pulled out her phone. There was already an email waiting from a law firm. Weston Vale was suing her. Emotional distress and interference with his business. She read it twice. Then, she started walking. By the next morning, her card was declined at the corner store. Her accounts were frozen. Vale's lawyers had moved overnight. When she got home, an eviction notice was taped to her door. She sat in the dark of her apartment, laid both hands over her stomach, and breathed slowly until the trembling stopped. She had left her old life because she'd wanted something clean, something earned, something that belonged only to her. She had built it one shift at a time, one patient at a time, for 6 years. It had all vanished in a single afternoon. She sat with that truth for a long while. And if you're still riding with me this far in, do me a favor and drop the word justice in the comments so I know you're here, because what Weston Vale wakes up to is only the beginning. Then she stood up. She went to her bedroom closet, moved a stack of boxes, and found the fireproof case tucked behind them. Inside was a phone she charged once a year, just in case. Just in case had arrived. She dialed a number she'd carried in her memory for 10 years. Han Jae-woon picked up on the first ring. He already knew. He'd been the man in the black coat. He had seen the slap happen in real time, watched her hands fly to her belly, watched a chief of medicine choose a donor over his best nurse. He had walked out that side door not because he didn't care, but because Ayanna had made him swear years ago that he would never act unless she asked him to. He had spent the last 22 hours waiting. When her voice came through, quiet and cracked at the edges, he closed his eyes. "I need help," she said. That was all. "You don't have to say another word," Jae-woon said, and his voice had never been calmer. "Go to sleep. I've got it." He set the phone down on the glass table of his penthouse, looked out over the lights of the city below, and made 4 calls. By morning, Weston Vale's troubles had already started. He found out at dinner. He was at his private club, the Ashcroft, deep leather chairs, the kind of place with no prices printed on the menu. He'd ordered 2 bottles of something obscene to toast the fact that a pregnant nurse had been marched out of the building where he'd expected an apology. When he set his card on the tray, the waiter returned 2 minutes later wearing the face of a man who wished he worked anywhere else on earth, declined. Weston snatched it back and called his banker. 6 missed calls already glowing on his screen. His company's stock had dropped 19% in the last 3 hours. His offshore accounts, 3 of them, in places chosen precisely for how quiet they were, sat empty, not drained, empty, as if the money had never existed. Then his head of security received a text. Weston watched the man read it, watched the blood leave his face, watched him pocket the phone, stand, and walk out of the club without a single word. Weston sat alone at a table with 2 untouched bottles and no way to pay for either. He spent the night trying to buy his way out. He knew people, dangerous ones. Men who had made inconvenient problems disappear for important clients. He met the first in a parking garage at midnight, slid a bag of emergency cash across the hood of a car, and showed him what had been waiting in his mailbox at home, a black envelope, sealed with a bead of crimson wax, pressed with a single raven's eye. The man studied the seal for a long moment. Then he pushed the money back, got in his car, and drove off. The second fixer didn't even sit down. He saw the seal and was shaking his head before Weston finished his sentence. The third, a man with a badly reset nose and a taste for jobs nobody else would touch, looked at the seal, looked at Weston, and said quietly, "You put your hands on someone you should never have touched. There isn't a soul in this city who'll take this. Not for any price." "Why?" Weston demanded. The man looked back at him with something halfway between pity and disgust. "Because whoever sent that doesn't bargain. He just collects." Weston drove to his private airstrip at 2 a.m. He had a jet. He had cash. He had a plan. Get out of the country, reach somewhere with no extradition, rebuild from the ashes. He was 50 feet from the stairs when the headlights hit him. 3 black SUVs materialized out of the dark edges of the tarmac like they'd been parked there for hours, which they had. 6 men stepped out. No visible weapons, no raised voices. They simply took his arms, pulled a bag over his head, and drove. When they lifted the bag, Weston was kneeling on a cold marble floor. The room was enormous and nearly black, except for a single light at the far end of a long table. Sitting there, with a cup of tea and an expression of total ease, was the man from the hospital hallway. The raven's eye tattoo stood plain on his neck. Han Jae-woon set down his cup and looked at Weston Vale the way you look at a problem you've already finished solving. Weston's instincts fell back on the only tool he'd ever really owned. "I have people at the federal level," he said, his voice fracturing. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jae-woon slid a tablet across the table. It came to a stop right in front of Weston's knees. On the screen played the ICU footage, full resolution, time-stamped, all of it, the shove, the shouting, the slap, her hands going to her stomach, the guards leading her out, doctor. Langston nodding along like a man being handed good news. Weston stared. Jae-woon said nothing for a while. Then, "You thought she was alone." His voice was soft enough that Weston had to strain for it. "You thought no one was coming." He leaned forward just slightly. "She has me." A lawyer stepped out of the shadows with a stack of papers. Jae-woon laid out the terms without a flicker of feeling. Every asset, the company, the properties, the cars, the patents, even the emergency cash already smoking in a barrel in the corner, transferred immediately. Every last cent poured into a legal trust for struggling single mothers across the city. The gift was structured so it could never be undone. The duffel of cash Weston had carried to the airfield had already been collected. Weston sobbed through the signing, real tears, not the kind that come from guilt, but the kind that come from watching power drain out of your hands and never return. When he'd signed the last page, the men slipped the bag back over his head. They drove 20 minutes. When they pushed him out, he hit wet pavement and rolled twice before he stopped. He tore the bag off and looked up. Hospital emergency signs, the same building. He was standing in the very lot where Ayana had stood in the rain, clutching a paper sack of her belongings, freshly fired from the only job she'd ever loved. Weston Vale sat in the downpour with nothing left but the clothes on his back. And then the police cruisers rolled in, because while he'd spent that week sleeping in alleys, Jae-woon had sent Weston's financial records to 3 separate federal agencies: tax evasion, embezzlement, wire fraud. 10 years of it, documented flawlessly, delivered anonymously. The officers stepped out. Weston didn't run. There was nowhere left to go. Morning light poured through the wide windows of a private suite on the 7th floor. The room was warm and still. Flowers on the sill. Soft light, the sound of a newborn breathing. Ayana held her daughter to her chest and looked out over the city. The baby had her grandmother's nose, a full head of dark hair, and a set of lungs that had introduced her to the entire floor. She was perfect. Jae-woon stood near the door, hands folded, watching his niece with an expression Ayana had never once seen on his face, something open, unguarded, human. He had bought this hospital 4 months earlier, quietly, through 3 shell companies. The board hadn't known who held it until the paperwork was signed. Then they knew, and then Doctor. Langston had quietly resigned, which turned out not to matter because the new ownership had already begun processing his removal. Langston was employed now, 2 floors down, though not as a doctor. The custodial team had been short-handed. As Ayanna watched her daughter sleep, she heard the squeak of a mop bucket rolling down the hall. She glanced up. Through the open door, she could see him, older than she remembered, moving slowly, eyes on the ground. He passed the doorway. He looked in. He saw her. He looked away at once and kept moving. She didn't call after him. She didn't need to. She turned back to her daughter's face. Jae-woon crossed the room and stood beside the bed. He looked at the baby for a long moment, then at his sister. "You good?" he asked. She laughed, a small, real, exhausted laugh. "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." He nodded once, the way a man nods when something he's been carrying finally sets down. Across town, in a federal holding cell, Weston Vale sat in an orange jumpsuit on a metal bench. The wealth was gone. The lawyers were gone. The investors, the board, the club members who had laughed with him over champagne, all gone. He had spent 44 years constructing a life in which no was a word other people said, never him. He had finally learned what happens when you turn out to be wrong about that. Ayanna kissed her daughter's forehead and breathed in the warmth of her. The storm had passed, not because the powerful man had fallen, though he had, all the way. Not because the coward in the white coat was pushing a mop, though he was. But because she was here, in this room, with her daughter breathing softly against her and her brother standing quietly at the door, and the world outside had no claim on her anymore. She had spent her whole life fighting for something ordinary. She had never realized that sometimes the people who love you fight for it too. If this one moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so the next story finds you, and I'll see you there. Because the quietest person in the room is never the weakest. She's just the one who hasn't decided to move yet